All right. Good morning. This morning, we're gathered here today to have, I think, what is one of the most important conversations. Conversation about diversity and inclusion. We have a panel that's a very amazing panel, which I'll just introduce in a few minutes. And their own personal stories and insights, I think, will help us unpack this core cultural pillar that we ourselves have been on a journey on. In fact, if I step back, I want to reflect on our culture and its transformation. The meme we use internally of growth mindset has helped us frame it appropriately. That is, it's this continuous process of learning and renewal versus getting to some destination. And to me, that's what today is all about. And because one of the pillars of our culture is diversity and inclusion, and one of the hard topics for us to confront, because the idea is not to claim growth mindset, but to have the courage to acknowledge the fixed mindset that we have, to push ourselves going forward. And that's really what today is all about. When it comes to diversity and inclusion, we've got to ask ourselves and have the conversation around bias, both within and around, and to be able to confront that collectively. And that, to me, is the only way for us to show our growth mindset in action. And so I'll come back and talk about some of the actions we're going to take. But first, I really want us to be able to learn from the panel and the panelists and their stories and their insights. And to really help us kick off the panel, I want to invite up Tina Brown, who is a trailblazer. I've known now Tina for multiple years. I've attended the event she holds called the Women in the World a couple of times, and it's just been super insightful for me to learn from her own personal experience and the people she champions around the world who are doing pretty amazing things. And she has a great background of accomplishment in her field of journalism. She's been, as I said, a trailblazer who was the editor of New Yorker, Vanity Fair. He's written a best-selling book recently, which I would recommend that you read. It's a fantastic read. And so with that, please help me welcome Tina Brown to the stage.
Well, thank you so much, Satya, and thank you for including me in this legendary 1 week at Microsoft, which I've heard so much about, and I can feel the energy and the sparks flying. So it's very, very thrilling to be here personally to talk to all of you today with this remarkable group of panelists that we have assembled here. As Satya said, we're here to discuss this very urgent topic of diversity and inclusion, which has really exploded, I think, sort of finally, after many years of often earnest, but also often not really successful experiments, largely because for organizations which mean well just are not living the message. It's a grafted on idea as opposed to a felt core value. So how do we stop seeing diversity and gender equity as a problem and start seeing it for what it is? It is an opportunity. It's not enough to have a will to transform organizations. The question is, what's the way to transform an organization? And that's what we're hoping to shine a light on today. So let me now introduce my amazing panelists here. Far right, Kimberly Brandt is actively changing the face of Silicon Valley. She's the founder of Black Girls Code. She's the founder of Black Girls Code, which is working to train 1 million girls of color in STEM by 2040. The first steps of which she hopes will become a stampede. Anna Marie Cauchi, president of the University of Washington. first woman, first Latina in the post, and she made a game-changing push for diversity there by starting the Husky Initiative, which allows qualified Washington State students to attend UW regardless of their ability to pay. Okay. Mighty Arlen Hamilton, right? Silicon Valley VC, and as such, more rare than a unicorn in that environment. After all, African American women receive less than 1% of VC money, and she set out to change that. In 2015, she founded Backstage Capital, which invests in startups led by women, people of color, and LGBT entrepreneurs. And finally, Darren Walker, my friend Darren, president of the Ford Foundation, and he's made addressing inequality its #1 priority. And with Ford's $13 billion endowment, he's driving a commitment to no less really than re-engineer the world to make it a more just place. So welcome all of you very much for being here. So what struck me as I prepared this discussion is that all of our panelists really started their lives as outsiders. So I want to begin so you get a flavor of each one of their amazing stories, really how they broke through that outsider status. So let's start with you, Darren, because you've traveled from very humble beginnings in rural Texas. What were the turning points for you, those pivotal things that changed your life and brought you to where you are today?
Thanks, Tina. I'm really, really grateful to be here. Thank you, Satya, for this invitation. So I was a queer little black boy in a small, rural East Texas town. And that experience for me informed how I have come to see the world. It is about inclusion. It is about justice. And so for me, the work of diversity is not an add-on. It's fundamental. It's fundamental to excellence. We know from the research and evidence that organizations that are diverse are higher performing organizations. And so for me, this is an easy conversation. It's about excellence. It's about performance. It's about delivering results.
But you escaped from complete chaos.
Well, sure. I didn't want to live the rest of my life in a small town on a dirt road in East Texas, of course. But I will also say that coming to a place like New York and living the life I have, I am very grateful for that. But often the question is, what can we do in the places we are to ensure that the ladder continues to be behind us and we're helping to pull people up?
Thank you. So, Arlen, you had, your story really blows me away because, you had no college degree, no mentors.
It's so sad.
No, I want to create the sob story first, right? No college degree, no mentors, no savings, and at times, no place to sleep. There were times when you spent your nights on the floor of the San Francisco airport. So that's not usually the qualifications for someone in venture capital, okay?
It is now.
It is now. So, tell us just a little bit about how you got out of that and what you had to go through.
Sure. Thank you. So if you don't know the story, I did come from all of that. And a few years ago, I noticed that there was a disparity between how much money, capital was going to anyone who wasn't a straight white man in venture and straight white men. Not to say that all straight white men were getting funded, but the ones who were, there was a disparity. And a lot of times there were opportunities to get into the room that others were not getting. And it just, as an outsider looking in, it just seemed ridiculous to me and absurd in a way. And I set out to talk about it, and I talked about it a little bit online. I got people behind that, and I said, people are probably going to pat me on the head for years if I just talk about it. I need to be able to have something in the game, and even if that's a small check, that kind of buys your way into being taken more seriously. And that was the thinking a few years ago. So I set out, and it took me 2.5 years to get the first person to really listen to me and believe in me. And I got that check from an angel who was a woman, and that's allowed me to set up shop. And in that time, most of it I was without a permanent home and had a lot of those issues that happened. And I don't look back on that with any sort of shame. I'm just glad that I'm not there anymore. I'm glad that I'll never go back to it. And it gives me a lot of relatability to the founders who are out there right now raising and building. And I think that's an edge that I have. And I think that, I'm definitely looking at this as a way to create wealth for myself and generational wealth. And so it's definitely bullish. It is an opportunity. It's not the charity side of things that I think so many people hang that on.
Thank you. Well, Anna Marie, you're the child of immigrants. You're the child of immigrants who fled the Cuban Revolution and lived a very different life, really, from the one, of course, that they left behind. And now you've risen to the top of academia. How did you navigate your success?
Well, I came to this country actually as a refugee when I was 3 and didn't know the language and had to kind of, learn my way through culture. People like myself, and I study people like myself, I'm a child psychologist, are often called cultural brokers. I often had to explain the American culture to my parents and help them understand, and at the same time explain my parents too. And in some ways, it's the perfect preparation for the job that I'm doing, because in a world that's increasingly multicultural, I'm still cultural broking. Right. So it was, it was the perfect background.
I love that expression, cultural broker. It's really a great way of describing it. Kimberly, decades before you founded Black Girls Code, you studied electrical engineering at Vanderbilt in the late 80s, which, for an African-American woman, that was a flat-out anomaly, right, to have you there. What powered you through that?
Well, I started, really on this journey in STEM well before I got to Vanderbilt. I always often say that I was just lucky to be pretty good at math, very interested in science, and have folks around me, even though I was like growing up in the inner city of Memphis, that saw that intellectual spark and were there to kind of push me into places that I wasn't aware of. I mean, growing up in Memphis, I did not see engineers around me. That was not a career path, especially for African-American girls in the mid-'80s, or even before that, didn't know what that was. And if it were not for those guidance counselors seeing that as a potential, seeing potential in me and pushing me that way, I wouldn't have found myself majoring in electrical engineering. But then that's where the awakening began. So like going from a predominantly African-American community to Vanderbilt was like culture shock to the nth degree. There was just a handful of Black students. I was often the only African-American girl in my classes and never had an African-American or a woman professor during my whole college career. It was difficult. But I think that experience, to Darren's point, it really ingrained in me this passion, and same thing that Arlen mentioned, for creating a different story, right? I love that piece about we come into our spaces of privilege and it gives us an opportunity to change the narrative. And that's what this work is all about for me, is just changing the narrative for other little girls that look like me.
If I might add something, I think that the way that people tend to look at people like us is we've overcome our background, when in fact our background is the seeds of the strengths that we bring to our positions.
I love that. That is so true. And actually, it leads me to what I was going to ask Darren, because I was going to say to you, Darren, obviously you had this unique background which made you want to pay it forward in the same way that Kimberly is mentioning. But that means that you also have to have around you people who are also courageous and who see things through the same lens, or the lens that you're trying to promote in Ford. What are some of the ways that you've done that at Ford with your staff and your board? How are you laying down this culture, of natural inclusiveness that isn't a foisted message?
Well, I think that it's really challenging for institutions like the Ford Foundation because we are a privileged institution. And so no matter how much we say we are inclusive, it's a challenge. I'll give you an example. When I became president of the foundation, the first 2 years after I was president, our diversity numbers went down. And they went down, my hypothesis is because people said, oh my gosh, we have a gay black president. We're done. I mean, we're done on this diversity. I mean,
that sounds like heaven.
And so our numbers actually went down for the first time in years when a gay black man becomes president.
Right.
And I think it just shows how institutions, no matter how progressive, inclusive you want to be, leadership has to be vigilant about these issues. And so for me, it was about having a board that would be vigilant and hold me accountable. And then on some levels, that meant our board had to become more diverse. And so the first thing for me was to work with my board chair. And so we have moved our board. Every director we've elected since I've been president has been a woman or a person of color. And that's not because there aren't really qualified white men. There are lots. It's just that we were imbalanced when I became president. And so now we have, I think, the proper balance. But I guess what I'm saying is, this is about leadership and the commitment of leadership to drive the message and to deliver on that message and on the mission and to challenge our privilege. Because an institution like mine can become very smug and arrogant about these things because we can think that we're better than
You're fighting the good fight.
And just because we do the work of justice. So we have to interrogate our own behaviors, and that's what we've been doing these last few years.
I wanted to add a little bit about that. I love that story from Darren because I think this is a challenge of organizations, whether large or small. It's a little bit different. So like even within Black Girls Code, as we started to add and scale staff, we had to examine our own issues around bias. And like, are we gonna hire all Black women to sit around this table? And if so, does that drive the mission? And we had to have some crucial conversations amongst ourselves to say, well, no, that is not what we believe in. That's not what we believe is going to help us drive the mission the furthest forward. And even if that meant we had to sit in some discomfort as we brought in folks that had different cultural experiences and backgrounds, but we did it. And the team has been better for it by having that diversity around the table. Even as a small organization, again, to your point, we focus on African American, Black and brown girls, but we understood that the diversity within our team made that mission even more fruitful for the girls that we're serving. So it's a leadership point it's absolutely about leadership and how we as leaders drive our teams to sit through that discomfort in hopes of being a better organization at the end.
Anna Marie, Mari, such a great message. You're educating and shaping the next generation. What are you seeing and learning from millennials regarding diversity? Because sometimes millennials don't want to hear from other points of view, and that discomfort with the other side can be, outlawed at times. I know that that's not as much true in your campus, but what are you seeing and learning from them, and what habits have you changed in your own leadership style as a result? What tactics seem to work for you?
Well, it's interesting. Millennials are growing up in a much more diverse background than are their parents or grandparents, just because of the shifting demographics in this country. Yet, at the same time, this country, we've been, in essence, growing into centers where people attracts like. And so what all the research suggests is that millennials embrace diversity. When you give any kind of survey, there's an embracing of diversity, but they actually don't know a whole lot about it because they've grown up in fairly homogeneous environments. And so in college, all these folks come together and they think they know a lot and they struggle. I think some as they begin to actually deal with difference across the table, not just on the TV, et cetera.
And how do you put in place, tactics and learning strategies to open that up?
Well, we have a number of them. We've started a race and equity initiative, which is really about conversations. And I think sometimes we say, well, it's all talk, but talk is important and talk leads to action. And that's what we want to make sure happens. We also have been very vigilant in terms of our admission strategies to look holistically at individuals, not to just focus on scores, et cetera. So, I think the first step is universities are the most diverse settings that any of our students have been in. And so helping them manage that so that they can draw from that and they're not all retreating into their own groups because it's more comfortable. I think it's a lot of exactly what you were saying is
breaking people out of tribes.
Yes, we need to be able to get comfortable with a certain level of discomfort. That's how we learn.
Yeah. Well, Arlen, I memorable. You said something very memorable. You said, "I came for the cake, not the crumbs," which I have been quoting a lot since. And women-led companies, they're just like drowning in crumbs, right? I mean, they get less than 5% of all VC deals. How do you get women out of that crumb category where people think, well, I gave she's a woman-led company, I gave her this amount, but it's never the same amount. It's not as much. How do you get women out of that?
Well, I have to say that's from a rap song that I have not identified yet. I wish I were that clever.
That's
but
okay.
I do say it. I have it on the wall in our office. I came for the cake, not the crumbs. And some would say I've had a little too much cake. Okay. I'm just sorry, I'm going to focus on it. I don't know if I'm going to do my stand-up career here. Well, yeah, I mean, it's a whole system, it's systematic, and to try to change that and as one person or one group is not something we want to attempt. But our part in that is we saw that 0.2% of Black women were getting funded, and when they do, for every, I think, $1.2 million that a white male would get in the same type of round, they would get about 42,000, which is up from 36,000 a few years ago. So think about what they have to accomplish with the same amount of money. They're expected to accomplish it, and then investors then say to them, well, why aren't you hitting these metrics? Why aren't you here? And they've already done everything else to get there. So we recently launched a new fund that will invest $1 million in Black women at a time to try to shift that, and that's what the meaning behind that was. And is it possible? Can I get a show of hands of how many people in the room are managers? Oh, cool. Yeah, great. Just wanted to. That's great. Thank you. Like being here right now, I think is a really good step. If you're in the room, you should already know you're in the right direction. I think sometimes D&I can be looked at as going to the dentist or something that is like, oh, it's the D&I panel, right? But I actually think it can be quite fun. I think that if there's anyone in the room that is a manager and wondering, I understand that it's financially it's better, and I understand that it's the right thing to do, and it's just not enough to kind of push you in that direction, or someone who feels that way when you're having these conversations, because you have conversations like that. I would say that the third piece could just simply be having a higher quality of life while you're here. It's more fun and more enjoyable to have a diverse group of people around you. You have to, you're working, you're spending more time at work than anywhere else, most likely, and it can just be more colorful, no pun intended.
That's right.
Can I add something? I just wanted to kind of really piggyback and highlight the work that Arlen is doing, because this work is extremely important. So, and I don't want her to undersell that. Like, this work is important. Like, did you hear when she said, like, Black women get $30,000, $40,000? She's trying to invest $1 million in each of these founders. That's a magnitude of difference. And let me finish. Now, the reason that's important is because we often talk about diversity and inclusion, but we really should be talking about diversity, inclusion, and equity.
Yes.
Her work is about equity. So if we're looking at these systems as being fundamentally unbalanced, then we got to rebalance the scale. And you don't do that by giving just another $25,000. You do that by over-indexing on founders like Arlen and the companies that she's supporting. And then we get closer to rebalancing the scale. But we will never get there if we do everything like we did yesterday and we did things in the past. We got to over-index, over-index, over-index. So this is why her work in the field and her voice is so critical at this point in time, because it shifts the conversation. We're not talking about just being diversity and including everyone. No, we're talking about equity, and equity is what really drives change. So look at that even in your work. Yes, you have some women managers, but how can we get more women to the C-suite? How can we get more women, I'm talking Satya, in these VP roles? I met fantastic women and men since my time here, but we need more of them. We need more people of color in these roles. That's how we really start to create these cultures that are both inclusive as well as equitable for everyone that's sitting at the table. And I'm really excited about the work that Arlen is doing to really drive that.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean,
Well, over-indexing. Darren, there are many, many organizations which have made sort of earnest attempts, to get this right, or they feel that they've made earnest attempts, and they've just been a big bust. Things really don't change. So is it a moment when change has to be forced? And if change has to be forced, what does that look like in terms of changing an
I think the larger issue is that, as we're discussing here, we have structural barriers to some of the progress we want to see. Our systems, our institutions have been designed to get us the outcomes that we have gotten, right? So if institutions are designed to deliver a particular outcome, and the outcome has been to have predominantly white people be the winners in our society. Our society was actually designed for that. Now, having said that, we have the mechanisms in our society, starting with our Constitution, that has given us the tools to make our society more inclusive. But in order to do that, we have to own the structures and the systems and the deconstruction of those systems to deliver more equity. And that is a really hard thing to do, because some people, and again, particularly white men, I'm married to one, so I know, white men will feel often unsettled by this. And we have to also, one of the things that happened to me recently that was really revealing was a friend who is a leader of a big Wall Street firm, a white guy who's straight, and he said, where's my safe space? Because I actually want to engage on these issues, but there's a risk associated because I'm actually kind of ignorant about a lot of this stuff, and I could actually say something that reflected my ignorance, and that could be misinterpreted as racist. That could be misinterpreted. I could lose my job. So I'm gonna be really careful how I engage on these issues of diversity, because there is a lot of risk for me if I actually, so we need to also make sure, and I'm not talking about the racists and the misogynists, most people do not fit into that, most men do not fit into that category. How do we make sure that we're having genuine, safe conversations so that everyone can put the issues on the table? Because if we're just having a conversation like many conversations I've experienced where white men sit in the room and say as little as they can, and we do all the talking, we're really not making progress.
Yeah, if I might add something. I think too often we do look at things as winners and losers. There's no question, I agree with you 100%, Darren, that things were structured to have certain groups win. But the idea of balance isn't that that group will win less. It really is about focusing on how do we make our society win? How do we make sure that we're all winners? And I'll give you an example. At our university, and this happened at universities across the country, when we started looking at how the tenure clock tended to work in terms of women. The tenure clock means in 6 years, it's up or out. Well, those 6 years are the years of prime childbearing, particularly for women, because their biological clock is more. And so universities around the country, we changed it so that people could stop the tenure clock and go on leave. That was done largely with women and childbearing in mind. In fact, when we changed that, not only did it allow non-biological parents to take a year off the clock and men to be more involved in child rearing, but we saw, for example, men stop the clock to do a startup. That flexibility was good for everybody, not just the women who were having children. And I think when we take diversity into account, it creates win-wins, not a new category of winners and losers.
Can I add one quick thing? Arlen, I was actually, Arlen, going to ask you, how a startup can lay down its own culture, obviously, and how do the managers in the room bring that sort of startup mindset to, in fact, an organization that has been long in the building?
One thing I wanted to comment too is that I agree with you. I also would say on the flip side of that, it sounds a little bit like when men are saying, I don't know if I can talk to my women coworkers because I'm going to get in trouble because and when I hear that or I hear the other, I sometimes think, you know how uncomfortable it is to be a woman every day or to be a person of color every day. So it's actually, if you are an ally and you're sitting in the room or you're watching and you're someone who is afraid, a little bit afraid because you may lose your job or you may be considered something, push through the fear because we do it every day. And it's part of what is going to help change things is that and you're absolutely right, there has to be us on the other side, us meaning underrepresented, underestimated people, willing to not jump at everything that we hear because, I learned that, recently with something I've learned about privilege, sometimes your words can get misconstrued and you had every intent to say something else. So I've had a lot of more empathy for white men in the last couple of years because I understand that rope they walk sometimes.
Well, and privilege can make you oblivious at times.
Yeah, that's right. It can definitely make you oblivious. Going back to the startup world, so we saw 3,000 companies since I started working on the fund, and invested in 100 as of May of this year, and that is something I am really proud of because it's happened. It's something in history that can't be taken from us, and it proved that there were companies out there being made by people that were not the usual suspects, and that was a question in 2013 and 14 when I was starting out. Will there be enough? And yes, there are. And so when I think about a company like Microsoft that's like 100,000 or so employees and more than that, wow, something like 125, something like that, and then like thousands of managers, I think about how cool that is because it's such an opportunity for each of these departments to feel like a startup within Microsoft. And that means that you can think in a more flexible way. And I won't pretend to know too much about the inner workings, but it seems to me that if you are a manager and you have the power to do so, really think about projects that you're working on. Can someone that hasn't had a chance at bat lead that project? Can other people take steps forward going towards the equity that we all deserve, right? So that sometimes when I know I've had many, like hundreds of conversations with white men who are running teams or companies, and their thing is, hey, it's a big mountain of pressure. How do I even just get started? And there are these smaller things, which is if you have a few projects a year and you can get a woman of color leading it where you wouldn't have taken the time to think about that starts to shift things in a major way if it's done in numbers. There's strength in numbers, and there's strength in thinking. And I also think that you have to really, I know we talked about intent at the beginning, but you do have to really want it to be different if you're a manager. You have to want it to be different, and then understand that you have that, you do have that control. You have more control than you think you do. And some people fight, like people on the stage, fight their whole lives just to get a taste of that power that you have, and you have it right now. And it's not a bad thing that you were born into it. That is not bad. Privilege is not a bad word. Entitlement is. So use your privilege and share your privilege.
Kimberly, the young girls who sort of graduate from your program and they're going into college, and it sort of applies to both of you actually, because you're the head of a university. It's not enough to be. I mean, I think the head of people at Microsoft has one of her mantras is to say, I come where I'm asked, but I stay where I'm welcome. Right. So it's not just a question of getting these girls into these engineering departments and into tech, which you're doing. How do the host organization make sure that once they're in, they are developed, they are nurtured and nourished, so that the experience is in fact a better one than just simply getting in, right? I mean, what do you suggest, both of you actually?
For me, it all goes back to culture and changing our focus from this I would say we focus on cultural fit rather than focusing on cultural transformation. Because the cultures that we have now are not welcoming to folks that come into the organization with diverse perspectives, and especially if we start to look at intersectional personalities and how folks present at work. So I think it's important that companies both reflect on what their cultures are and identify ways that we can shift the needle so it's more inclusive and more welcoming for everyone. I think the role that we do as an organization at Black Girls Code is really about feeding this pipeline. Like, we're feeding this pipeline, but we often think in the office that, are we doing this work and pushing our girls into places that are not going to be welcoming to them? In many cases, our answer is yes, we are. And with that realization, we understand that we have to prepare the girls, because this path of changing culture in the tech industry is a long one. And in many ways, it goes right back to equity for me, because I believe, and this is, I'm telling you, like, I honestly feel this way, the culture won't change and be more welcoming until there are more people. There's more women in positions of authority. There's more women and parity in organizations and engineering organizations. It won't shift because it will default to the dominant culture. And so this is something we have to be intentional about, shifting the numbers, getting more diversity in the spaces, in the decision-making, so that when our girls get to these companies, they not only are able to feel welcome, but they also feel that they belong there. And that starts with companies changing the dynamics internally so that they can create it a bit more welcome. It's like going round and round, but like, it's not the chicken before the egg. I mean, I'm doing one thing, but the companies, I think you have to shift your equity as well so that women actually stay.
Yeah, I think there's a range of things, and I could, go on, but I'll focus a little bit on what Darren was talking about, is look at the structures. For example, I focused on the tenure. You have to go from equality to equity. It was equal. Everybody came up on the 6th year, but because of women, biological clock, our jobs in child rearing, it was not equitable. And so looking at all your structures, every way that you do things, most of our departments had faculty meetings at 3 o'clock. Guess what? If you're going to pick up your kids, that might not be the best time to have faculty meetings. So we've done a range of things from doing cohort-based hiring, et cetera, but I think that fundamentally you have to look at your structures because there are structural barriers in addition to people comfort and all those kinds of things.
Correct. Darren, we tend to think of diversity really almost too much as either ethnicity or gender. I mean, what about other kinds of diversity? Diversity of age, the disabled, political views, dare I say, not a very popular subject right now, but actually engaging with the other in terms of what you think. How do you handle that? And what is your advice on getting other kinds of diversity and making sure that doesn't get lost?
Sure. I mean, I think it is really important that we not limit the definition of diversity to race and gender, because I think the notion of justice demands that we look at people who have been excluded, starting with people with disabilities, who, if you want to talk about a population who has been treated unjustly in American society, what happens to that community is incredibly unjust. I also think the issue of perspectives. I don't want to get into politics per se, but so for example, at a place like the Ford Foundation, I believe it is important to have people who aren't just all progressives in that way. Now, it would be hard to work at the Ford Foundation if you didn't, for example, believe in the right of a woman to choose. Right? I mean, it would be really hard to work at the Ford Foundation. But that doesn't mean that you have to agree with everything that Planned Parenthood says, but that we do share some values about things like women's agency, for example. It would be really hard if you didn't believe that LGBT people, Q people, should be leaders. It'd be hard to work at the Ford Foundation. But I benefit from hearing the perspective of people who aren't just a part of the typical Manhattan bubble, ecosystem that we're all so subjected to. So it's hugely important, and we should, when we're in a room and everybody's liberal and everybody's progressive, we should actually ask ourselves if we're missing a point of view.
Right. Absolutely. Well, sadly, we're running out of time, but I wanted just to do a sort of a lightning round to each of you, sort of going off what Darren just said. I'd love each of you to tell us, if you can, someone who's changed your mind or something that's changed your own minds. I mean, we're trying to ask people to change their mindset. What's changed your mindset? Let me go back to you.
Yeah, I'll go back to early when I touched on, I call what I have today, after 3 years ago being homeless and on food stamps and all that, to not, I'm not rolling in it, but I have, I can get on a plane now at the airport that I was leaving in. I call what that is augmented privilege. It's something I'm thinking about, writing about, because I've been siphoning privilege as I go most of my life, really, starting at 4, but especially in the last 3 years. And so I've now very quickly learned what it's like to have more privilege than I had before. Certainly had before, I had privilege of being able-bodied. I had privilege of being free, free speech and all of that a lot of countries don't have. So I had privilege before, but now I have it in a way that, I still walk out of the house, a black gay woman, very proudly, but I still walk out the house like that. And I do have more empathy for different points of view, especially those that are dissenting, because everyone has a story. Everyone has a story. Everyone has a background. You cannot put everyone in one box and say, white guys did this and they do that. It's really been driven home.
Thank you. Anna-Marie.
Well, I mean, to be a little bit glib about it, I grew up in a very politically conservative household with parents who loved me dearly, but were quite frankly homophobic. So I've come a long way. And I do think that I've benefited extremely from people with very different backgrounds, very different beliefs that are still very much a part of my life. But probably the single thing that most recently really changed for me was we had some leadership initiatives at our university, and I kind of came in with a bit of the bias, not that leaders are born, not made, but that leadership built organically, that you couldn't, how shall I say, force it or orchestrate it. And I have been so impressed by the leadership programs that our students have started and the kind of self-reflection that they're doing, that I am a total convert and I am like gung-ho on leadership programs.
Interesting. Kimberly.
I would say for me, one thing that really changed my mind about advocacy and the work that we're doing is recognizing the power that each individual person has to make a difference. I can say without a doubt that the reason I'm here today, the reason we're having some great conversations around partnering with Microsoft with Black Girls Code, it was because of employees, folks that work right here, like recognizing the work and then going back to their managers and their leadership team and advocating for us and being able to make a difference and realizing in that moment that, wow, I don't know that we always recognize the power of the individual, single individual, to really make this radical change and difference and move a mission forward. And I think that's something that was a pleasant surprise for me and something that really kind of changed my approach, perhaps, to how we do this work in the future.
Darren, last word.
I'll just say briefly, a meeting that I had a couple of years ago with the leaders of disabilities organizations across the country, who brought home for me that of the top 20 largest American foundations, only 2 make, at that time only 1, make grants around issues related to the rights of people with disabilities. And we joined, but even after 4 joined, there are literally only 2 foundations of the large foundations in America that have grant making for people with disabilities and the organizations that represent and advocate for them. And that had a profound impact on my understanding of how justice needs to be defined in this country.
Well, thank you so much, all of you. We could go on and on here because you're all so full of insights and new thoughts, actually. I want to thank this remarkable panel for sharing their insights. I personally was riveted by everything you had to say. And I would now like to invite the fearless leader, Satya, back to the stage, because I know he has some things that he'd now like to add as a wrap-up.
Thank you so much. You know, first of all, what an amazing panel. I learned so much. I was going to go watch it again. Thank you so much. You know, I want to close by going back to the 2 things that I always want to talk about and I like talking about, which is our sense of purpose and our mission to empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more, and the cultural journey that we are on, which is this continuous process of renewal and using growth mindset. But it's for us to reaffirm our commitment on both of these. So with that, I want to make concrete announcements. The first one is really inspired by Arlen, your story. And when I first got to know of this, and I know Peggy and others really dug in, it just stuns me that as we sit here today, that only 2% of the money that goes into venture capital goes to women-led startups. And so to me, I think that's something that's got to change, and we want to act. And so this morning, Peggy and her team wrote a blog about how our venture arm, which is going to really create a fund and a competition. So it's the Female Founders Competition, which is a global competition as part of Microsoft Venture Fund, will invest in these women-led startups.
It's working.
And I would really encourage everyone to go read the blog and really participate in this. And the second thing that, Kimberly, you mentioned this, which is the people who were inspired by when you came and talked at one of our events, and that ground up sponsorship for your work is what really enlightened a lot of us to the great work that you are doing. So I am really thrilled today to announce that in partnership with Kimberly and her team, that we are going to sponsor the opening up of the Seattle chapter of the Black Girls Forum. So again, I want to close by thanking all of you for sharing your amazing, amazing stories, the insights that you unpacked for us. And you should know that for us at Microsoft, one of the things that drives us is we are privileged to be in technology at a time where technology is shaping every part of our economies and societies all over the world. But yet, I believe that us as a company, we derive our deepest satisfaction, deepest meaning when we can take that privilege, take that opportunity, and ensure that we empower every person and every organization. And you gave us many, many pointers on how we can do that by both living our culture and living our mission. Thank you all very, very much. Thank you.